Morning, everyone. Welcome back after Constituency Week. Welcome to the 142nd meeting of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. This meeting is being televised. Our first order of business today is the consideration of the votes of the interim estimates 2019-2020 for the House of Commons and Parliamentary Protective Service. We are pleased to be joined by the Honourable Jeff Regan, Speaker of the House of Commons. Accompanying the Speaker from the House of Commons are Charles Robert, Clerk of the House, Michelle Patrice, Deputy Clerk, Administration, Danielle Paquette, Chief Financial Officer. Also from the Parliamentary Protective Service, our Superintendent Marie-Claude Cote, Interim Director, and Robert Graham, Administration and Personnel Officer. Thank you all for being here. Now I'll now turn the floor over to Mr. Speaker for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Thank you for welcoming us here today. J'ai le plaisir d'être ici.
I'm pleased to be here to present the 2019-2020 interim estimates and to address the funding required to maintain and enhance the House administration support to members of Parliament and the institution. I am joined today by members of the House Administration's Executive Management Team, who you know well, Charles Robert, Clerk of the House of Commons, Michelle Patrice, Deputy Clerk Administration, and Danielle Paquette, Chief Financial Officer. I will also be presenting the interim estimates for the Parliamentary Protective Service. Therefore, I am also accompanied by Marie-Claude Cote, Acting Director of the PPS, and Robert Graham, the Services Administration and Personnel Officer.
2020 include an overview of spending requirements for the first 3 months of the fiscal year with a comparison to the 2018-19 estimates, as well as the proposed schedules for the first appropriation bill. The interim estimates of the House of Commons, as tabled in the House, total approximately $87.5 million and represent 3/12 of the total voted authorities that will be included in the upcoming 2019-2020 main estimates. Once the main estimates are tabled in the House, I anticipate that we will meet again in the spring, at which time I'll provide an overview of the year-over-year changes. Today, I'll give you a brief overview of the House of Commons' main priorities. Ensuring that members and House officers have the services and resources to meet their needs is essential in supporting them in the fulfillment of their parliamentary functions. And by the way, I will, of course, Mr. Chairman, try to speak at a rate where it's possible for the interpreters to interpret, because we all appreciate the wonderful work they do. But I don't wish to make it more difficult. L'administration cherche avant tout.
The House Administration's top priority is to support members in their work as parliamentarians by focusing on service delivery excellence and ongoing modernization. As an example, this past year, we have seen the opening of 4 multidisciplinary Source Plus service centers, which are ready to provide members and their staff with in-person support. A team of House of Commons employees is available to provide assistance related to finance, human resources, information technology, and various operational services offered by the House Administration. And if members of Parliament ever have comments on that, I will be very pleased to hear from them. Another service delivery initiative has been the implementation of a standardized approach for computer and printing equipment in constituency offices across the country. This initiative was launched as a pilot project this year, and its purpose is threefold: to ensure parity between Hill and constituency computing services, to enhance IT support and security, and to simplify purchasing and life cycling of equipment in the constituency offices. In addition, all constituency offices will now be provided with a complete set of standard computer devices and applications following the next general election.
aims to provide innovative, effective, accountable, and nonpartisan support to members. To do so, it must attract and retain an engaged, qualified, and productive workforce that acts responsibly and with integrity. Cost of living increases are essential to recruitment efforts for members, House officers, and the House administration as employers, and funding for these increases is accounted for in the estimates. Members will know that employee support programs are also a priority. These programs, which are offered to employees of members, House officers, research offices, and the administration, include an employee and family assistance program and other resources and events, such as those taking place this February for Wellness Month. The renewal of our physical spaces and the services provided within them is another priority for the House administration. The opening of West Block and the Visitor Welcome Center is the most significant change to date to the parliamentary precinct. We believe that the West Block is a model to other parliaments tackling similar challenges with respect to aging facilities. In fact, many of you I know are aware that at Westminster they're planning to to move out and have a major renovation to to the Palace of Westminster, which of course is an immense undertaking. The House of Commons works, but that will be a few years away still. The House of Commons works closely with its parliamentary partners and with Public Services and Procurement Canada in support of the long-term vision and plan. For the coming years, the focus will be on decommissioning and restoring Centre Block. We will also continue to review and update the House of Commons requirements and guiding principles for future renovations to the parliamentary precinct. The administration of the House of Commons will continue to look at ways to best engage members in the Centre Block project moving forward and to ensure they continue to be part of discussions on the design and operational requirements for this building, that building. An ongoing priority is the operation, support, maintenance, and life cycle maintenance and management of equipment and connectivity elements in all buildings. This work is essential to providing a mobile work environment for members and the administration, which is something that we, of course, all now expect. Je passe maintenant au budget provisoire.
And now we will look at the Parliamentary Protective Service interim estimates. The Parliamentary Protective Service is requesting access to $28 million in these interim estimates. The funding requirements align with the 4 key strategic priorities of the service: protective, operational excellence, engaged and healthy employees, balanced security and access, and sound stewardship. The majority of the PPS annual budget is attributed to its first priority, protective operational excellence, which includes personnel salaries and overtime costs. In keeping with the service's aim to allocate existing resources as judiciously as possible, several posts were added to the overall security posture in response to the opening of the interim accommodations. I would suggest that if members have any questions with respect to the security posture, the committee may wish to go in camera for that exchange. Naturally.
Classified the positions of all protection officers, which led to an increase in their salaries retroactive to April 1, 2018. PPS has also successfully reached a bargaining agreement with the Senate Protective Service Employees Association and an extension of the previous agreement with the Public Service Alliance of Canada. For this reason, funding has been earmarked to make payments for retroactive economic increases as a result of these negotiations. As PPS evolves, the service is gradually reducing the presence of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in certain areas on Parliament Hill and within the parliamentary precinct, and in turn increasing the resources and presence of PPS officers. The remainder of the PPS budget ensures that the administration, which supports the operations of the service, is adequately equipped and resourced. This means ensuring that security assets and technology are properly managed and that employees are continuously supported in their health and well-being. As PPS approaches its 4th anniversary this June, its administration is becoming more agile and responsive to the needs of Parliament and of its own workforce. Monsieur le Président, voilà ce...
Mr. Chair, this concludes my overview of the 2019-2020 interim estimates for the House of Commons and the Parliamentary Protective Service. My officials and I would be pleased to answer any questions from members. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will begin with Mr. Graham.
For the speed at which you speak, and I keep looking around and feeling all these eyes looking at me. So, anyhow, je vais passer directement à Madame Côté sur la question des...
I would like to ask a question of Ms. Côté. You are the 4th interim leader of the Parliamentary Protective Service, and we've seen a lot of conflict with the unions, and we're waiting for results from the Labour Board. Can you talk a little bit more about this? Thank you. Thank you for that question. I would first like to thank the chair
and for Mr. Speaker for his support. My vision is the same than my predecessor. We always want to work in harmony with our employees. So this is what will be my goal for as the interim.
Okay. As you know, as you've probably seen in the last few years, my primary concern is that when PPS was created after the October 22nd shooting, it brought an element of the security reporting to the executive branch. There's an element of that by virtue of being an RCMP officer under the definition of the RCMP Act. You report by necessity to the commissioner. For me, that is a long-term concern as far as protecting the democracy itself of this country. And so what I'd like to know from both the Speaker and from PPS is there a long-term desire to keep the RCMP directly involved in the Hill in this capacity? Is that the objective in the long term, or would you like to see a different approach?
According to the legislation, I report to the speakers. However, when it comes to operation, I report to the commissioner of the RCMP. That's, of course, how it's been done. And in terms of changing anything like that, like it's not for me to change the legislation.
So it's a matter for Parliament to determine how that should operate, and obviously, as the Speaker, I will live with, of course, quite happily, whatever Parliament decides in that regard.
That's fair. And do you find that you have the authority you need over PPS in the capacity of Speaker?
I would say that I find that when I raise concerns with PPS, I get swift action, and that they work hard to try to make any improvement that members feel is necessary. So I don't feel there's a problem. I haven't felt a problem with that, and I appreciate very much the cooperation of the superintendent as well as her predecessor, who is now, of course, head of the RCMP in Manitoba, for which we congratulate her. But as I say, I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on what Parliament ought to decide in terms of legislation if Parliament decides to pass new legislation, if a future government or if current government decides to bring legislation to change the Act so that the PPS is not headed by a member of the RCMP. Again, that's a matter for Parliament, and I don't think that's appropriate for me to comment on something like that.
That's fair. Now, you mentioned in your opening remarks that you'd invite us to go in camera at some point to discuss some more operational matters, and with the consent of my colleagues, I'd like to do that later on in the questioning. There are some questions I'd like to ask that are more appropriate in that vein. But in the interim, I do have a couple more for you. Ms. Cote, I've suggested to your predecessor in the past that RCMP units who are assigned to PPS, Division 4, support some form of identification to show that they are PPS to help with force cohesion. And I know that's difficult with the RCMP uniform, but is there any efforts to look at possibilities of adding a PPS insignia or PPS unit pin of some sort to show that the RCMP officers assigned to the Hill are part of PPS?
That could be a possibility. It's not something that we are looking at right now because it's for the RCMP. They're still employed by the RCMP, so this is why we have two different uniform. It's as if the easiest way to see it is contract. We're being contracted to work on the Hill, so it could be a possibility.
I think you recall me. I think one of us said already that we have seen already, and we will continue to see a reduction in the number of RCMP personnel
Yes.
on the Hill, and an increase. Therefore, they'll be replaced by members of PPS.
Although my privileged concern on that one is that there's any members of the RCMP who necessarily report to the commissioner who goes to the minister. Which
No,
is
no, I understand your
which is
concern.
which is a separate topic from that, yeah. My last question on PPS before I go on to this beautiful new building we're in. The PPS's budget is about $90 million a year, about 20% of the entire House budget, as compared to Gatineau, which Gatineau and police and fire together about $109 million for the entire kit. How does this compare to what it cost prior to amalgamation, and are we getting our money's worth from it, just very directly?
We use our resource effectively and use different strategy to ensure that we optimize them and that we deploy them to always ensure that the House can go on with their business, and that we have also our protective mandate that everybody still feels safe.
Okay. Have we had, in the last few seconds, have we had any difficulties with establishing security in this new building while still having officers assigned to center block, for example? Because we know we expanded the footprint that we need to cover fairly quickly.
Yeah, but in that, like, we made the request, like, for the mains in order to be able to accommodate with the new buildings, and we're pleased with what we have right now, like, and we utilize those resources as like we need.
Of course, as I understand, there's less requirement for security in center block because members of Parliament and visitors to Parliament Hill and employees aren't over there. It's primarily going to be Public Services and Procurement Canada employees and the contractors who are there. So it's not the same requirement, although after the small leak we had, of course, as you may recall, I think some people, the cabinet was meeting there for a period of time, and so that required some personnel there during that, I think, relatively short period.
All right. Thank you.
Maintenant, Monsieur Reid.
It is appropriate under the circumstances to differentiate between the small leak and the large leak that's on everybody's mind. So I appreciate that point of distinction. I had a series of questions which I gave to you, Mr. Speaker, but just before I start going down that road, I wanted to say that I thought that Mr. Graham had a thoughtful comment with regard to the idea of separate insignia and with regard to contracting. Of course, RCMP contracts with provinces all the time, so I suspect there are some useful precedents that are at least partly relevant we can look at. My questions are about the upcoming changes to the centre block that will presumably extend beyond the careers of most of the people in this room today, and how we can ensure ongoing oversight. So I was hoping, Mr. Speaker, I could ask you to give us a little bit of information about your role in that and about where you think our role should be. So the first question I had was this: can you describe your role and the role of the Board of Internal Economy up to this point with regard to the governance and oversight of the parliamentary precinct renovations for West Block and projecting forward to those that will take place for Centre Block?
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to tell you basically how it works. And integrated multi-level governance has been established within the Administration of Public Services and Procurement Canada and the parliamentary partners, us and of course in the Senate, to oversee the project. The Minister of Public Services and Procurement Canada is the official custodian of the parliamentary precinct, buildings and grounds. So think of PSPC as the landlord and we're the tenants. And in fact, the House of Commons will, I guess, turn over or relinquish control of Centre Block to PSPC, officially in a few months. Now, they're already there working, but we are still extracting some things that we require from that building to store them, to renovate them, whatever. So I've had, I think, good cooperation so far in terms of being able to express my views and ensure that the views of members are heard in relation to the renovation that will take place. But as I've stated before here, I think it's incumbent on us as members, and in particular as on this committee, I would say, to continue to insist on being part of that process. Now, I'm not suggesting, I've not had any indication that there's not a willingness and a desire from PSPC or from the architects involved in the renewal, and there are architects in the House of Commons administration who are also involved and will continue to be involved to ensure that our concerns are heard and recognized in what is done over at Centre Block. And I'm pleased that there is this process that I described at the beginning of a joint management of that involving the House of Commons administration and the Senate. But as I said, I think it's vital that we continue to insist on that we insist on things like access for the media to members of Parliament, as they've had in the past in Centre Block, access, of course, to the public as much as possible within the kinds, we are all aware of the need to have protection, but also the need to have as maximum access possible for members of the public, because we want this to continue to be a democracy.
Thank you. I concur with your feelings about there being no desire to keep us out of the oversight capacity, nor would there logically be at this stage of the process of renovating Centre Block. We're early into that, and so nobody's had the opportunity to make mistakes they hope nobody will notice yet. But here's a question. When funds are required for parliamentary precinct renovations, including for remediation of such problems as will arise, to the best of your knowledge, does the spending authority come through the main and supplementary estimates for the House of Commons, or does it go through Public Service and Procurement Canada or some other process? And do they flow through you or the Board of Internal Economy?
Go through the mains, wouldn't it? Yeah. Michelle Patrice.
To answer your question, I would say it come from both sources, whether public procurement services, and also from the House of Commons main estimates. A lot in terms of the House of Commons main estimates would be staff in terms of assisting, helping, and also replacing certain piece of equipment, but mainly would be from procurement service.
Which means which committee? Do you know?
And I mean from the Public Works.
So that's the primary place. Therefore, I presume it would go through the main and supplementary estimates and of the department as opposed to the House, right? Because our involvement, once we hand it over, I mean, there'll be at some point requirements for us to deal with things like equipment, as Michelle mentioned, but the renovation, the reconstruction of the place, of course, is primarily up to the department.
Right. Do you sit on any non-parliamentary advisory groups related to the parliamentary precinct renovations?
I don't personally, but Michelle, how does that work?
No, there's no such group that exists at the present time. So the speaker obviously doesn't sit on any such group.
Okay.
And obviously it's intended that we're going to have a discussion with the board later this week in terms of the governance and the oversight that members of Parliament must and should have in terms of the requirement of the Centre Block.
There was a parliamentary precinct oversight advisory committee, which obviously was not a formal part of the funding approval process, but it did exist. That was established in 2001. It was chaired by former Speaker John Fraser. Does that still exist as far as you know?
Doesn't exist anymore, and I believe that at that time that group was reporting to the Minister of Public Works.
So are you aware of anybody, any sort of successor to that reports to the Minister?
No, there's none that exists at that moment, because we're having those discussions actually with Public Works in terms of a going forward process to ensure that members of Parliament, the board, and groups like the committee like this one can have a meaningful input on the requirements.
And if you don't mind, I know I've got just a few seconds left. Do you have any idea when you'd be getting back to us with suggestions as to what that process might look like?
It will be as soon as possible. Like I said, we're gonna have a discussion, start the discussion with the Board of Internal Economy, which has the main oversight, I would suggest, in terms of the requirements and the needs of the House and its members.
The board meets Thursday.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Christopherson.
Speaker, thank you for being here, sir, clerk, and everyone else. If I can just pick up where Mr. Reid was, and I know, Speaker, you're aware of the reaction to this committee when it came forward, and we've reflected on West Block and felt there was a real absence of individual MPs collectively having a say. And I understand you're going to talk to the Board of Internal Economy. My question to you, Speaker, would be this, and I'm not holding you anything, just off the top of your head. We talked about this a little bit. We've just begun the process of saying, hey, we need to be more involved, and we're now talking about how do we do that. But I'm not aware of a formal mechanism per se between us and or yourself and or BOIE. Now, we could create something ad hoc. There's nothing to stop us from communicating with each other. But, Chair, it's my understanding that we don't have any real formal process per se. So just some of your thoughts, Speaker, as we go through this with a view to any advice or concerns or ideas that you'd like to leave with us as we do our part of it, but more I'm looking at process. How do you see us playing that useful role in a meaningful way without both being irrelevant and too big of a problem? Which is a tall order, but just your thoughts, sir.
Well, Mr. Christopherson, I don't see you as a big problem. I want you.
You say that as I'm leaving.
No, but I appreciate your interest on issues like this. And it seems to obviously you know that the committee is a master of its own affairs and can look to examine the things it wants to examine. But I would hope that on an ongoing basis that this committee would pursue this topic, would not only, of course, have visits from me as speaker or future speakers at administration in the future to discuss this, but you might also want to call folks from Public Services and Procurement to talk about the issue of the renovation at Centre Block and how it's going, and to make sure that the concerns of MPs are being heard. I have found so far that when I've in the process raised issues with the architects and others from both the House and PSPC. They've been very attentive and anxious to hear what the concerns of MPs are, to understand how the building operates. You know, when John Pearson and Jean-Lemaire Marchand designed the building back in 1916, and over that ensuing period, they clearly sought to understand how Parliament works, how members of Parliament operated, what they needed to do their job well, the access that was needed for the public, etc. They didn't have the security concerns that we have today, but they were anxious to do all those things. And I'm impressed that the architects seem to be concerned about all of those things. So while the board, I expect, will, the Board of Internal Economy, I expect, will seek some kind of formal mechanism on an ongoing basis. My thought would be, I think, that this committee might have a less formal but continuing interest in this matter, and make sure that it has witnesses to talk about this on an ongoing basis and is able to express its concerns.
I liked it all except the end part. You're kind of watering down our role there.
Well,
I'm not keen on that.
Well, if you want to take a formal role, go ahead. Right?
If I might change gears, I have some questions too about PPS, which won't come as a surprise. This is my last kick at the cat. After this, I won't be here when this comes up again. I just want to emphasize that I do hope that Mr. Graham and others grab onto this issue and refuse to let go. It is absolutely unacceptable that the guns in Parliament are controlled by the Prime Minister, by the executive branch, and that's the structure right now, and it's wrong, and it needs to change, and I suspect, based on being around here for a while, it's really not going to happen until there's minority, and somebody puts it on an agenda and says, you want a deal, then we go back and do things the right way there. But it breaks my heart to leave here, having spent time on the Security Committee at Queen's Park, having been a Solicitor General, been a parliamentarian now for far too long, and to see this kind of aberration and abuse of the parliamentary system, and this continuing. I say this, we just ran into this with the House voted to deny a member to have their say, and it was based on politics, not the reality, in my humble opinion. And too many times Parliament is allowing the continuing immigration of power to go from Parliament to the executive, and it's a struggle to get it back. So that's my last rant on that, and I just hope that in the future it does get changed. Last question, if I may, I'm short of time. I'm just curious on this one. It's just me. I'm curious how the Black Rod process is going to work now. Is she or he actually going to have to march all that way, or will it be set up in here as if it was? I'm just curious, being an avid parliamentarian.
Well, first of all, let me indicate my appreciation for your insistence that members of Parliament continue to insist on the notion that Parliament is paramount and not the executive, that the executive reports to Parliament, not the other way around. As you can imagine, in my role, I consider that fundamentally important.
You do a good job of emphasizing that too, and I've seen you do it internationally.
Thank you very much. Michel Patrice, or Monsieur le Clerc, Monsieur le Préfier.
Actually, we had a dry run to actually experiment with the process, and we were able to do it within 20 minutes of bringing the Black Rod to the House of Commons and sending over to the Senate the contingent from the House that would be part of a royal assent ceremony, and presumably a similar process would be followed for the speech from the throne, though we would expect that there would be higher participation on behalf of the members.
Touche. Thanks, sir.
Thank you. And considering that the Board of Internal Economy is going to discuss this soon, each party here has members on the Board of Internal Economy. You might speak to your member at that board, what your feelings are. Okay, now we'll go on to Mr. Biddle and sharing with Ms. Sahota, I think.
Thank you so much. I only have one topic that I'd like to bring up. And Mr. Speaker, you mentioned and perhaps this isn't a fair question to you, the constituency office IT pilot. And our office was selected, lucky us. Yes, and yes, and Ms. Lapointe as well, Madame Lapointe. But I understand a standardization of services, but MP offices aren't necessarily standardized. And for example, one service that my office provides is a low-income tax clinic. And we require software from the Canada Revenue Agency to operate that tax clinic. And we were initially told, no, you can't have that. And this was, in my mind, fundamental to what I do and what my office does. And we do about 2,000 tax returns a year, and to eliminate that service. And the suggestion from IT was to have a second set of computers, which I don't think anyone would find acceptable who came into our office. And we received a laptop to try this software, and it hasn't worked, and sent it back. And I'm worried that if this is the case for a Government of Canada software that cannot be used in the pilot program, what are other MPs going to do with other pieces of software that they deem necessary for the operation of their office?
Software that you're using and that I presume any member can use in their constituency office, provided that they can put it on the computers, which IT is saying you can't do.
Well, they're unable to do it at this point, yes.
And I'll bet they're working on it, but I'm delighted that our head of IT, Stefano Bay, is here, because I can see he's dying to give you an explanation.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, Mr. Speaker. I wasn't aware of the issue, Mr. Bill. We'll take note of it. But just to clarify, we wouldn't want you to use another set of computers. We feel that you can use the computers of the House. Having said that, the question for us is, will that computer that be using that be connected to the House infrastructure? For security reasons, we'll have to determine that. But we shouldn't have an issue to allow you to use that software on one of the pieces of the House without having you to buy a second PC. So I'll take note of that, and I'll have some of my group get back to you today, sir.
Thank you so much.
And if it's the case also for Mme Lapointe, we'll actually
But I don't know if Mr.
I'll just be
Christopherson,
proactive in my answer.
I don't know if Mr. Christopherson would want to have, Government of Canada software, right, with House of Commons. I mean,
As you know, in Quebec, we have 2 tax income. We don't do that.
Thank you.
Chair. Mr. Speaker, today, this morning, you had given your decision about the incident that occurred on February 4th of racial profiling in one of our parliamentary precinct buildings. And as you're aware, it was Black History Month celebrations going on that week, and we had a whole bunch of young people, because that was the theme of Black History Month this year, on the Hill advocating and lobbying different MPs and ministers. It was called Black Voices on the Hill. I understand that the incident was deemed not to be a point of privilege because it did not happen to a member, but you did mention that it was one that you take very seriously and one of great concern. So I was wondering if you could shed some light a little bit as to when you looked into the matter, what you discovered and how we can prevent this from happening, because we absolutely want to make sure that these young people feel that they are that this is their place and they do belong here. And so it's definitely quite an upsetting incident for all of us that heard about this. We want to make sure that they do feel boundless. And with this incident having occurred, I think it's quite the opposite that they must be feeling right now. So if you could give me some information on that.
Well, first of all, I guess I would have to say that I would obviously refer you to my ruling. That's the encapsulation of what I'm saying on this topic. As you mentioned, as you understand, of course, the question of what is a question of privilege and what isn't is pretty clear. And strictly speaking, I suppose you could say that there's not a way under a point of order or a question of privilege to raise this issue because it doesn't really it's not about the rules of the House and the procedure in the House or the impact on an ability of a member to do their job in the House and so forth. But I think everyone would agree, I hope, that it's an important matter and important that it be dealt with and responded to. And that's what I've attempted to do.
Absolutely.
So, but I'm going to ask Madame Superintendent to respond in terms of the issue.
Thank you. I'm truly sorry for what happened. We apologize for what was experienced. Upon learning of the incident, I asked for an immediate investigation, and I gave the report of my investigation to Mr. Speaker. My expectation is for all of my employees to be respectful and professional, and we are looking at how we can improve to ensure that such incident does not reoccur.
Okay. Were there any measures taken to contact the young people that experienced this incident on the Hill?
We apologize publicly about this incident in the media.
Okay. But not personally to them?
Well, when we receive a complaint, we contact those complainants. So the complaint that we got was from a senator, and then we went back to the senator with the report, with the information, and we're continuing on having discussion.
Did you find through your investigation that there was any kind of incorrect protocol that was used in this circumstance, or is there a change in protocol that's needed?
For me, the constable was asked to perform his a duty, so that's it was more than just the constable that was involved. So I'm looking after my employees, so I'm addressing the PPS employee only.
Well, we hope that it doesn't occur again. Thank you.
Ms. Oda, and now Mr. Reid.
I want to be respectful here of, as I go forward, of the time necessary to allow us to go in camera to deal with the matter that Mr. Graham wanted to raise. Okay. I gave a series of questions to you, Mr. Speaker, at the beginning of the meeting, and the next question on my list has already been partly answered, so I'll just kind of go through it and then make a meta question out of it to allow you to answer it. On December the 11th, 2018, we met with officials dealing with the Centre Block rehabilitation, and they indicated a consultation process with parliamentarians be created. I had 3 subsidiary questions coming from that. Number 1, would that be coming via the Board of Internal Economy? The answer I think I got to that was yes, but you can correct me if I've misunderstood that. The second subsidiary question was, are you able to tell us anything about when that process might be proposed? To which I think the answer was soon, but a kind of an uncertain soon. Thursday's very soon. Okay, that is very precise. At the board. Actually, at the board. And then to what extent will MPs have input into the structure of these changes before they go forward? So is it purely going to be via the Board of Internal Economy? I'm now looking post-Thursday, obviously. Or are there other mechanisms by which MPs will have a say in the initial configuration of the ongoing consultations that presumably would last for a decade or more as we try to implement all of the different things that that we would collectively like to see implemented in that renovation?
It seems to me that you may be not preempting, but you know that the board will make that decision, the decision about. It will make a decision, and I'm not going to prejudge what decision it will make on Thursday. Between now and Thursday, I think members should be encouraged to express their views to the members from their party who sit on the Board of Internal Economy. Of course, they can express their views to other members as well of the board, and then the board will decide on how to do this. But I think that your comments, I would imagine, would be taken into account by the board in that deliberation. So, keep it up.
Yeah. So there's a recent media report that changes to the initial plans for the West Block renovation, which I think also encompasses the Visitor Welcome Center, generated over 100,000 pages of communications regarding what are called, I'm quoting here, regarding deficiencies in construction, engineering, design, and architecture at the West Block and new Senate chamber. That obviously is a lot of material. When construction problems of that nature are identified, I'm looking to the past now, but as a model for the future, to whom would that information have gone? I'm thinking in terms of people who are actually members of Parliament. Would that have gone, that material, to members of the Board of Internal Economy? Would any of you know the answer to that question?
Well, in relation to the question, that information I haven't seen, so I could not answer. I could not say that any members of the board or the administration were aware of those specific 100 pages of communication. I certainly
100,000.
100,000 pages, so I haven't certainly seen it. In terms of construction problems, there's some, and I'm going to state the obvious, but there's some that have occurred, and I'm going to use an example, which is the south door and the west door of this building. As far as I'm concerned, there's been construction deficiencies because those doors have not been operating properly since the operationalization of that building. South door has been fixed and replaced. We're still having issues with the west door, and it is my understanding that it's going to be fixed this weekend. So we had to do some interim measures to have it accessible to members this week, for example.
But I think, Mr. Reid, you're talking about the whole time during which West Block was being renovated, aren't you, or are you?
I'm using this as my way of opening up the point that there are many detailed documents that emerge, many changes and compromises that have to be made as one goes forward. It is in the nature of the process. I would be surprised if Centre Block generates less than 100,000 pages. I suspect it'll be a good deal more, and not because of anybody doing anything wrong. It's the nature of this kind of complex, multi-stage, multi-year process with many players. No, the question really is, looking forward, and this is really the point, how do we ensure that we have maximum openness to these problems as they arise so that we can deal in a business-like manner with the issues of, number one, how much the various compromises are going to cost, Number two, what will have to be sacrificed once we make a compromise? Are we willing to give up on some feature we wanted? And finally, how it'll affect the timing of our return. Rather than pursuing the details of how it was done in the past, maybe I could just ask at a more a personal level, Mr. Speaker, if you have any thoughts as to what the best way is of dealing with this, recognizing that the chances are that you and I will be out playing golf in our retirement by the time this is done.
We can look forward to that. You'll probably beat me, but I can look forward to one of those games someday. It seems to me that it will be important that that the board create a process whereby obviously there's input ongoing, where those discussions can take place and where members can have input to that process. How exactly it's going to unfold remains to be seen, but I appreciate your thoughtfulness. You know, the way the concern you express about this, your concern that this be done in a way that is responsible. I think you're right that undoubtedly decisions will be made, that there may be compromises from time to time that have to be made. But it's up to us as members, whether it's representatives of the Board of Internal Economy or this committee or members generally, to make sure that our concerns are heard, so that the desire we have to ensure the public is served properly and that Parliament functions the way it ought to is understood.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to all of you. Thank you.
Mr. Graham, just a quick question, then we'll go on camera.
I want to follow up on Mr. Biddle's question to Mr. Obey on the technology in our offices. I declined to participate in the pilot project for the new computers in our constituency offices when I asked if I could install whatever I needed to on my computers, and they said no, which I can do on the old ones. And so this is more of a request than a question, but if you could have a much more efficient process for approving software for our computers, it would be very helpful. There's an awful lot of software that we might want to use that isn't on your very narrow list of proprietary, not very secure software that is nominally secure, like all the Windows stuff, which is proprietary and has no way of doing proper security oversight, when there are open source solutions that are much more secure and much more affordable. So I'd like you to look at that. Thank you.
That many of us, along with using the Windows system on computers, also many of us will use either iPads or iPhones, use the iOS, right? Mm-hmm. And in those cases, there is kind of a firewall between the two sides, as you know, between the kind of the house side and the other side of that, and where you can put on other things, other apps and so forth. It's an interesting distinction between the two systems, and it seems to be more difficult to manage that within the Windows environment, which works well in many ways. That's not really an answer, but it's an observation.
Well, and technological security is a whole field in itself, and it could be quite a long discussion here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We'll suspend just for a few seconds here while we go into camera. Shall vote 1 under the House of Commons carry? On division? And shall vote 1 under Parliamentary Protective Service carry? On division. Carried. Thank you very much. We appreciate your coming again, and I'm sure we'll see you again when we get to the main estimates. We'll suspend while we change witnesses. Good afternoon, Minister. Good afternoon and welcome back to the 142nd meeting of the committee. As we consider the votes in estimates under Leaders Debate Commission, we're joined by the Honourable Karina Gold, Minister of Democratic Institutions. She's accompanied by the following officials from the Privy Council Office: Alan Sutherland, Assistant Secretary to Cabinet, Machinery of Government, and Matthew Shea, Assistant Deputy Minister, Corporate Services. Thank you for making yourselves available today. I'll now turn the floor over to you, Minister, for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the committee. Apologies for being a couple of minutes late. I am pleased to be here today to discuss with you the Supplementary Estimates B 2018-2019 and the Interim Estimates 2019 and 20 for the Leaders Debates Commission. I am pleased to be joined by my officials, as you mentioned, Al Sutherland, Assistant Secretary to Cabinet, Machinery of Government and Democratic Institutions, and Matthew Shea, Assistant Deputy Minister, Corporate Services. Les débats des chefs jouent un rôle.
The leaders' debate play an essential role in Canada's democracy because it is a key moment in the election campaign. It offers voters an opportunity to familiarize themselves with the ideas and the visions of the future leaders of Canada.
More than just media events, they are a fundamental exercise in democracy. As such, they may be organized in a way that is open and transparent and that puts the public interest first. They must also be entrenched as a public good that Canadians can count on in each and every election to help inform their voting decisions. Traditionnellement, les débats.
Traditionally, the leaders' debates in Canada were organized and funded by a group of broadcasters, Global, CBC, CTV, and others. A private arrangement was made with the parties regarding the priorities and arrangements.
Objective criticism for many years. Moreover, there was no consistent, clearly defined participation criteria that were applied in the 2015 debates, with some leaders participating in all the debates, while others only participated in a few. L'accessibilité des débats.
Accessibility of the debates was also limited. For example, we had debates in French that were not accessible to certain French communities.
I was asked to bring forward options to establish an independent commissioner to organize leaders' debates during future federal election campaigns, which was reaffirmed through a Budget 2018 commitment. $5.5 million over 2 years, recurring each election cycle, to support a new process that would ensure that leaders' debates are organized in the public interest. Notre gouvernement
Our government called for comments from Canadians during an online consultations and a series of roundtables that were contributed to by universities, media groups, and others. I also welcomed the study from last fall that heard from 34 witnesses over 8 meetings in the committee, and there were also written submissions from people interested.
Expressed that leaders' debates make an essential contribution to the health of Canadian democracy. There is broad support for and value in the creation of a debates commission that is guided by the public interest, and there is a need for open and transparent information on the organization of the debates, and especially debate participation criteria. Stakeholders also expressed that a permanent debates commission needs to be built to last and that it is important to get it right. During my November 2017 appearance before PROC, I outlined a series of guiding principles that would inform the government's policy development for the Leaders' Debates Commission: independence and impartiality, credibility, democratic citizenship, civic education, and inclusion. La Commission
The Commission exercises its responsibilities independently and impartially. The Commissionary has the independence needed to manage the process and to manage the $5.5 million over 2 years.
These funds for items such as salary, including the hiring of an executive director. Additional costs are expected for the contracting of a production entity, the operation of the Commissioners' Advisory Board, awareness raising and engagement with Canadians, and administrative costs. Excuse me. During his November 6, 2018 appearance before PROC, the Debates Commissioner, the Right Honourable David Johnston, stated that it would be his intention and duty to use funding in a responsible manner, and he would seek every opportunity to reduce costs while also recognizing the need to make debates available to the largest possible audience. The Commission will continue to be fully independent and impartial as it prepares to execute its primary mandate to organize 2 leaders' debates, one in each official language, for the 2019 general election. La Commission est dirigée.
The Commission is directed by the Commissioner as well as by a board of 7 members and should be fully operational by the spring of 2019. By March 31st, 2019, there will be a report with conclusions and recommendations for the possible creation of a permanent commission.
Ensure that 2 informative, high-quality, engaging leaders' debates are broadcast on TV and on other platforms in 2019. In conclusion, I would reiterate that leaders' debates are a public good. The Commission will help ensure that the interests of Canadians are central to how leaders' debates are organized and broadcast. I look forward to hearing your feedback and welcome your questions. Merci.
Merci.
Thank you.
Curious, Chair, if there's a particular reason why the Minister didn't give us the courtesy of a copy of her remarks, as is customary.
Apologies, I'd be happy to share them with you. Sorry, there was no reason. I'll check with my staff what happened.
They should have known.
Yeah, apologies.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll start with Madame Lapointe.
Thank you and welcome. Thank you for coming today. I listened carefully to your remarks, and I understand that the Debates Commissioner's responsibility is to oversee all of the aspects of the debates and to provide the 2 debates in both languages, regardless of where people are located. So I just wanted to check whether minority communities of both languages will have access to the debates across the country. And second, as you know, I'm the mother of 4 adults who now live separately and they don't have cable. So how will you make sure that they are aware of the debates and have access to them? Thank you. I think it is important to point out that the Commissioner will act independently. We will make sure that the Commissioner has the resources he needs to make decisions and to be able to carry out his mandate. So it will be up to him how he proceeds, but certainly the idea is to ensure that everyone across the country has access to the debates. And this is why the debates will be accessible in both official languages. And during the consultation, we heard, among others, from a Nova Scotian French-speaking community who told us that they did not have access to the debate in their language. So that will be up to the Commissioner. How he does it will be his decision. And in response to your other question, this is something we heard about across the country. It is important for the new generation of Canadians who mainly don't have cable, or in many cases, they don't watch television in the traditional way. And we have given the commissioner the mandate to make sure that the debates are available on all the various platforms, social media, other digital platforms, and also, of course, traditional media through the internet. We want to make sure that people have access to the feed, and then people can decide how they want to access the debates. Do you have anything to add, Mr. Sutherland? You seem to be indicating by your gestures you might want to say something. No, I was just agreeing. Thank you. It's very important, I feel, to make sure that information on the debates is available so that there's some context. You have mentioned that the commissioner is independent in his decision-making and that he should be ready to go in the spring of 2019, up and running. Will he have everything that he needs to carry out his mandate? I have confidence that Mr. Johnston is very capable. He is working hard. He will have what he needs to carry out his mandate independently, and we are working to make sure that he has those resources. He and his team will do the work, and it's important that he have what he needs to do it. Taking a larger perspective, the commissioner will see to the organization of the debates, but do you have any other suggestion on how to strengthen our democracy? Yes. On this initiative of creating a debates commission, I think that this is important to have the commission and the commissioner so that voters can see how the leaders debate among themselves, how they think on their feet, what their ideas are. So there are many things there that strengthen our democracy. I think that we made also a very important announcement 2 weeks ago about protecting our democracy against threats, cyber threats, and foreign threats. As well, it is important to talk about our democratic system and to make sure that people have the tools they need to be well informed, to identify sources of information. This is important, and something that I announced with my colleagues from Public Safety and National Defense is the civic and digital engagement, and this is important as we move toward a more digital world, to be able to deal with digital platforms wisely. We need people to be able to identify sources of information, to be able to judge what sources they can trust. And of course, there's Bill C-76, which is very important. So that is very important as well. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Nader.
For joining us. And actually, I want to begin by thanking you as well for your service as Minister of Democratic Institutions. And I understand that you won't be seeking re-election this fall in Burlington, so I did want to thank you for your service to Burlington.
Why not?
It was just my assumption that you weren't, since you were here defending an independent debates commissioner, that somehow you'd removed yourself from the partisan
think
process. I suppose that's not the case then.
I'm here because I'm the Minister of Democratic Institutions and you invited me to come, and because the Debates Commission is supported through PCO, and that's why I'm here, because of your invitation. But it is absolutely an independent process, and I'm very much looking forward to seeking re-election and serving the good people of Burlington in 2019 and beyond. So thank you for the opportunity for me to mention my amazing constituents and how proud I am to serve them.
And
So
it is a
thank
great
you,
riding. I have been there several times,
Yeah.
and it's a great riding in Burlington. I want to begin by
The
asking...
neighborhood's great.
The whole greater Hamilton area.
That's true. That's true. The Bay is a good community.
You'd mentioned in your opening comments that an executive director had been hired. Could you inform the committee who that is?
The executive director that has been hired is Michel Cormier, who is formerly of Radio-Canada.
And what pay level, pay grade will they be at? Are they a deputy minister level, an assistant deputy minister level?
The committee on the pay level, I'm not sure. They would not be a deputy head level. The commissioner is in that type of role, but they would likely be an executive somewhere between EX2 and EX4.
Yeah, if you could provide it to the committee. Now, was it Michel Cormier? Will they be a full-time member, or will it just be on a contract? How long will that person serve in that role?
I don't have that level of information. I think one of the things, this is a good opportunity to remind the committee that they are independent, and so we don't get overly involved in their HR, their finance. We just make sure their bills are paid, they have HR support, but we don't really get into that level of detail, and we make it a point not to get overly involved in that level of detail.
Has PCO had any consultations, or your minister's office had any consultations with Mr. Johnston on potential appointees to the 7-person advisory board? Have any names been provided to either your office, minister, or to PCO on potential appointees to that panel?
The only thing I would be aware of is that, just like the rest of the public, all of the individuals who participated in the roundtable, but that's not something that has been provided. That's just public information.
Will those members be appointed via order in council?
They'll be hired as per diem appointees under professional services.
Has PCO or the minister's office had any consultations with the major broadcasters or the social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, on the potential distribution of this leaders' debate?
Only as part of the roundtable discussions that happened last spring.
So there's been no efforts by any of these groups to lobby either PCO or your minister's office on the outcome of this. Would the chair or the commissioner be subject to the lobbying commissioner's overview in terms of reporting of lobbying having been undertaken to either the commissioner or the executive director? Would they have to report any? Would lobbyists have to report any interactions with those?
I can confirm
positions?
lobbying. They have the same obligations for reporting as any department. So they're set up as a separate department, and so they have full reporting obligations like any other deputy head across the government.
Thank you, Chair, and I believe Ms. Cusi will take the remaining time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nader, and thank you very much, Minister, for being here today. So I know that something that's been of great importance to you is to have participation in this process from all other political parties. So if you could please expand what consultation process has taken place to this point with the other political parties to further this process along.
Since the appointment of the commissioner?
Correct.
My office has not been involved since the appointment of the commissioner, and the commissioner is responsible for his work since being appointed.
Okay, I will have to say that this is the second time you have mentioned this. You mentioned it within your opening statement as well, and my colleague did make a remark that his joke to open up, but I don't believe that independence can be used as an excuse for not having knowledge of the process and not being able to share information in regards to the process with this committee. So I guess I would just ask you to please consider that for future visits here.
Yeah, I mean, that's your point of view, but I think that actually independence means independence, and so that means that the minister is not directing or involved in the commissioner's ability to make those decisions, and I really do believe in the definition of independence. So We have not been involved whatsoever, but I'm happy to be here to answer the questions to the best of my ability.
And my point of view would be that the purpose of you being here, Minister, is to provide the committee with a fulsome update. And when you tell us that you do not have the information, I'm not sure if your colleagues who are here with you today can provide further information to that. That is what we expect as the opposition and as the committee, and we expect to have that information in some capacity or another. My colleague touched briefly upon the 7-person advisory panel. You mentioned that outside of public information, that there have been that is the only information that's been provided so far in regards to appointees to this panel. Can you elaborate further on if one of the individuals will be from the PCO and who that might be?
From the independent advisory panel?
Yes.
As I said, that's up to the commissioner to make a decision as to who they are. And I do not have knowledge of who he is thinking about at this time.
Okay. So, as my colleague also made reference to some of the costs, when the Debates Commission was announced, it was also publicized that it would be given a budget of $5.5 million for the 2 debates. Again, have you been given any information in regards to a budget or an itemized budget, since it is the government that is responsible for the dispensement of these funds? Because again, I feel as the committee, and being here that we are discussing the estimates, we have the privilege and the obligation to review the expenditure. So if you could provide any additional information in regards to a budget, and specifically as possible, we'd appreciate that information.
So I'll handle that. I'd maybe just take you back to when that $5.5 million figure was come up with. That was a best estimate, and that was an up to amount. I think the debates commissioner has made clear that his goal is to actually live below that budget, and any interactions I've had with him from an internal service perspective has certainly been along that lines. I can tell you that probably in the realm of $900,000 to $1 million of that will be salaries, with the lion's share being other operating. And so that's for things like professional services, which will include the advisory committee, advertising services, communication services. There'll likely be a large contract that would be related to actually holding the 2 debates. And so that's where the lion's share of the cost will be. The Debates Commissioner's Office has made clear they're still finalizing that exact budget, but that's what our $5.5 million estimate was based on, and I think it won't be far off that from an overall split. There may be differences between what they spend on professional services versus advertising, but I think the salaries, as I mentioned, are pretty bang on.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kusi. And now Mr. Christofferson.
Thank you, Chair. And Minister, thank you very much for being here. Starting on a positive, let me just say how impressed I am that not once in the entire term since you've been a minister have you played games, jerked us around, dodged any invitation to come here, no matter how difficult the subject, and that's appreciated and respected. Having said that, we're on that file again. And I just need to make a statement, and then I'll move on. But again, the undemocratic nature of the Democratic Reform Ministry still takes my breath away. And it's still not acceptable. Well, I shouldn't say it is acceptable because we have no choice, but it's not warmly accepted that the government unilaterally appointed someone that plays such a key role in our democracy, and it leaves open the argument for those who didn't want the Leaders Debate Commission to have a legitimate broadside. And again, the lack of respect for the commitment of this government to independent committees and the importance of committees in the main, in large part, has just been talk, talk, talk. And we haven't seen the walk, walk, walk. So, having said all of that, I accept the rule of Parliament, who decided this is in place, and so we move forward. And we'll deal with any changing after the fact, which I will speak to a bit about in terms of accountability, but we do accept that this is now in place. And I got to tell you, on a personal basis, the only thing that saved the day for you was the integrity of the person you picked. I mean, papered up a lot of the cracks in the walls, but those cracks are there, and you know the election's coming. You folks are going to have to wear it on these things. So, having said that, moving on. In terms of the members, and I respect the independence that you're alluding to, and I believe that by the sounds of it, that's being respected. But at what point does independence meet accountability? What exactly is the vehicle as you see it, given that there's no guarantee who the government is next time? But how do you see it right now in terms of the accountability back to this committee or some other entity, having given people all this independence, all this power, and all this money? What's the accountability? And may I just ask, because I'm going to be short of time, will that include a detailed budget next time rather than just a macro number?
Thank you very much for your question. And if I can just put this on the record, because I know that my colleague is not actually seeking re-election next time, and I don't know if I'll have another chance, although I'm always welcome to come back to the committee, so I know you'll invite me back. But just to say how much of a pleasure it's been to work with my colleague, Mr. Christofferson, and I think Parliament will be missing him next time around because he does serve with a lot of integrity. And
Very kind, thank you.
And it's not just because you're my neighbor, but I have a lot of admiration for you.
It helps.
It does help. So anyways, if I could just get that on the record, I'm glad to say that.
Thank you.
With regards to accountability, I think that's a really important question, and it was something that we did try to build into the process with regards to the debates commissioner coming back to this committee within 6 months of the election, I guess a bit less, March 2020. To talk about how things went and also to provide an update and also plans moving forward.
Sorry, including a detailed budget?
I think, I don't know if it said detailed budget in it, but is that?
So
yes.
As per the OIC, the debates commissioner is required to provide a report on an in-depth analysis of the experience of the 2019 debates, the organization of the debates, and advice for the future form of a leaders' debates commission, and that report is to be tabled in Parliament.
I do think, though, that with regards to the next estimates, that's something that could be explored definitely by this committee. I also think that one thing that the committee, and of course you make your own decisions, but I think one thing that should be asked is whether the budget that was in place for 2019 was sufficient, too great, what the experience was. And I would imagine that the debates commissioner, when he tables that report and would like ultimately, I believe, to come back to Parliament, will have suggestions in terms of how a budget could be allocated given the experience that we have this time. And I think because this is the first one, we're hoping that we're providing sufficient resources to be able to deliver on the mandate. But I think the experience of this first time will serve greatly in terms of a more built-to-last model.
Thank you. The advisory board is obviously key. Are you aware, or is it public, what the criteria is for acceptance? And is it the intention of the commissioner to make public the names of these members as they're appointed?
Yes. So if you look at the original Order in Council document, if you look under Advisory Board, Section 8.2, it reads, the Advisory Board is to be composed of 7 members, and its composition is to be reflective of gender balance and Canadian diversity, and is to represent a range of political affiliations and expertise. With regards to specific job description, that would be up to the Commissioner to decide, and it would be his responsibility to publicize these individuals as well.
In a timely fashion? When? Will they be appointed one at a time? Lump appointment?
Again, that would be a question that he would have to answer. Our understanding is that we can anticipate this in spring 2019.
Going forward, what is the relationship between you and the commissioner, given the sensitivity around elections, debates?
Yeah.
I mean, there has to be a reporting mechanism, so there's something, but I would... assume you're respecting independence. How's that going to work?
Yeah, so I'm respecting independence. I mean, essentially, since his appointment, we have not had a conversation and do not intend to have one. The accountability will, of course, be through the budgetary process, and PCO is providing back office support. But in terms of the decisions that are being made, we've provided the broad outline, the expected objectives, and it's up to the Commissioner to deliver those.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Minister. Appreciate that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Christopherson. Now on to Mr. Biddle.
Thank you so much, Minister, for being here.
Excuse me.
Hope you're feeling well. And that you will feel better soon. As a fellow parent of a toddler, it's they touch everything, and that does not necessarily assist with parental health. But thank you so much for being here, anyways. I guess one of the things that I know the answer will likely be, Mr. Johnston will be responsible for this. But I was wondering if you can discuss, and during our study, one of the things that really touched me, because something that we don't often think about, because we are individuals, able-bodied individuals, and don't think about persons with disabilities and how they access debates. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, the framework, and what you've heard on that subject.
Certainly, and it's a good thing I'm this far away from all of you, so hopefully you don't catch the daycare plague. But with regards to accessibility, I mean, this is something we heard a lot of during the consultations, particularly for those that were hearing impaired or vision impaired. And one of the interesting conversations that we had during the consultations was with a vision impaired advocacy group that were talking about if you could make the sound of the debates, the soundtrack available as well, and to actually broadcast it on radio or podcast style would be very interesting for them, because then they can kind of use it in as they will, and then also to ensure that there was sign language interpretation during the broadcast. As well. So, of course, this is all in the report, which the Debates Commissioner has access to, but one of the mandates is really to make sure that the feed is accessible to people of all abilities. The other thing that I would say, too, that came up that was quite interesting was with regards to making the feed available in different languages. So, obviously, with regards to our 2 official languages, to make sure that we have a main debate in English and a main debate in French. But if there was a possibility to work with groups of diverse backgrounds as well, to make sure that for people whose first language is not English or French, that they may also be able to access these debates as well. So I think it's a really important question, and one that I know the Commissioner himself is seized with. Accessibility has always been a passion of his, and so I have confidence that he'll be able to deliver that.
Switching gears, probably dramatically.
Okay.
And I saw in the news, I believe it was in Australia, the report came out, and perhaps beyond a report, I believe it was the Prime Minister that announced that major political parties had been hacked by a quote, sophisticated foreign actor. As we head into an election, I know this is something that concern been raised by all parties and all members around the table. How do you see things as we're obviously moving forward in an election year, and there are those nations out there that seek to cause harm, sow doubt, and are willing to act against the democracies of our allies, and we've seen that in Britain, we've seen it in the United States, and we've now seen that in Australia, and we're up next. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, I think that this is an extremely important topic, and I think it just goes to show that you can't be too careful in this space. And I'm very pleased that we have had a very productive working relationship with all of the political parties, the main political parties represented in the House of Commons on this. They've been engaged with the Communication Security Establishment. CSE is there to provide advice, and we've had some really good conversations about protecting our democracy writ large. And I have to say that at least until now, people have and parties have put partisanship aside in this specific area and really been focusing on ensuring that we're protecting Canada first. And so that's been very positive. And I think the Australian example just goes to show that we have to take this seriously here in Canada. One of the things that I announced during the Protecting Democracy announcement on January 30th was the fact that we will be extending security clearance to all of the political leaders represented here in the House of Commons, but also up to 4 of their aides and advisors, so that they can be briefed and up to speed, because ultimately this is, a Canada First policy. So, we're prepared. We obviously can't protect against every eventuality, but I've been really encouraged by the fact of everyone working together on this file so far.
Okay. And we had Facebook and Twitter before our committee in regards to Bill C-76, and we raked them over the coals a bit. But my worry is that they said, "Oh, don't worry, we'll be good. We'll be good. We'll have things in place, maybe, possibly, hopefully, possibly, maybe, in the future, sometime, maybe." Have you had any discussions with the social media companies as we're moving forward to the election?
Yeah, so I've had conversations with both Facebook and Twitter. I'm going to be meeting with Microsoft this week and hopefully Google in the coming weeks as well. And I think that Canadians are rightly concerned, and I think that they are rightly feeling uneasy about the role of social media in our upcoming election. I think it's going to play an even bigger role than it did in 2015. And I think that while there have been some positive steps taken by the platforms to, deal with fake accounts and inauthentic behavior, and particularly from foreign sources, I think that there's still a lot more that can and should be done, and we are having conversations to that fact. One thing that's interesting to me is that all of the major platforms have signed on to a code of practice for the upcoming EU parliamentary elections in May. And so we're following that very closely and trying to determine if that's something that would be both effective and worthwhile to take here. I think one of the biggest challenges with regards to social media companies is precisely that accountability factor, in that at the moment they are saying, just trust us, we're doing things, and we don't necessarily have the mechanism to assure that they are, apart from the items that were passed in C-76, so with regards to ad transparency and not knowingly accepting foreign funding on their platforms for political advertisements. But I think this issue is one that continues to evolve, and we continue to learn a lot about. We need to be certain that the companies are acting in good faith, and that they're taking this issue seriously, and that we are ensuring that the loopholes that do and have existed are closed, understanding that our adversaries are always evolving as well.
Thank you, Minister.
I would like to start with a point that Ms. Lapointe raised earlier.
That there are 3 online video channels in the U.S. which are watched by billions of millennials, and in fact, these are backed by the Russian government. And more appropriate to this conversation and to Canada is the recent CBC story that regarding the amount of tweets put out by foreign trolls. In fact, 9.6 million tweets put out by foreign trolls, having a significant impact, not only now on our debates processes, our electoral processes, but also very significant democratic processes. And in fact, these tweets have been shown to influence such things as thoughts in Canada on both immigration as well as pipeline approval. So I am wondering what you are doing, what your government is doing in regards to foreign interference and influence that goes beyond our electoral processes to our democratic processes.
Thanks. It's a really interesting question, actually, and one that I would welcome the committee looking into as well, because I think it's very important. It's one that there's a lot of gray area. So it's not gray area when you know it's coming from a foreign source, right? That's not something that we want. And I always talk about of overt and covert, right, influence campaigns. So there's overt foreign influence, which is diplomacy, essentially trying to achieve a certain outcome, and all countries in the world participate in that. And then there's covert, where you're perhaps posing as a Canadian or as an organization that's Canadian, but really is funded from elsewhere. And knowing about that can be quite challenging and difficult. And I think that's something that we saw, in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election, that was something very new that we hadn't really seen before, although, foreign interference has always existed. It's just existing in different channels now. We want to ensure that we're providing space for legitimate debate in Canada, right? There are issues ongoing, particularly when there's not an election, and that was something that was very much part of my thinking with regards to third-party advertising during the pre-writ period, and not doing it before then, because while Parliament's in session, you want to ensure that Canadians can be, in a sense, unfettered in their ability to interact with parliamentarians and raise and discuss important issues. The question and the tricky zone is how do you know where that initial information is coming from? And that's where I think the civic, media, and digital literacy is really important to help Canadians inform themselves of what kind of markers to look for in terms of where information is coming from. If you're seeing a Twitter account that maybe only has 15 followers, but is tweeting nonstop on a whole range of issues that are kind of weird, then maybe that's not a legitimate account. Maybe that's coming from somewhere else. And so it's those kinds of conversations that we need to get started on. Twitter and Facebook have been taking down accounts, millions of accounts, of fake accounts that they can confirm are coming from foreign sources posing as legitimate domestic actors.
Minister, my apologies. I'll have to interrupt you there. No, sure. I agree, and I've often said that it's like radiation or free radicals, right? You know it's out there, but you certainly can't see it. I'm just concerned because in the U.S. we've seen the establishment of the Global Engagement Center in charge of looking for fake information as well. In UK recently, they put forward, the UK lawmakers, the necessity of a compulsory code of ethics. So this is obviously something that's of importance for the committee. So with that, Mr. President, I would like to put forward the following motion on notice, that the committee invite the minister, who has already welcomely stated she would be happy to return, to appear before the PROC committee again to discuss the government's plan to safeguard the 2019 election and the security and intelligence threats to the elections task force.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's good. That's your time as well. So
great.
Go on, next speaker. Yeah, Mr. Hardy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have a concern. It relates to a story that I heard directly from Marshall McLuhan, which means this was a long time ago. And there was a story about an attempt by the Russian government to modernize and lighten up, and they started a big nightclub in Moscow, which failed after about 6 months. And they had a big commission onto it. And somebody said, well, was it the booze? It's all the best stuff, the food, fantastic. What about the chorus line? Everyone a good party member since 1917. So,
do we have confidence that Commissioner Johnson is going to glue together something that will actually resonate with the Canadians, the ones that we're actually trying to serve here? What kind of, do we have any oversight of this at all, or have we just basically said to the Commissioner, go forth without any kind of leadership? Are there broadcasters on his group? Not Mr. Cormier, because Mr. Cormier sounds like senior management who probably never saw the business end of a camera. But I'm talking about people who actually have the skills and demonstrated ability to present a program that engages the public.
We don't know who's hired. Just answer it really quickly and then you can go. I have a lot of confidence in Mr. Johnston to hire the right people for this. I think his storied career speaks to his passion for the public interest, but also his most recent experience as Governor General has enabled him to engage with such a diverse cross-section of Canadians that I really do feel that he will understand and appreciate how to ensure that these debates are, put together and accessible to as broad an interest of Canadians as possible. And I also think that, the public reporting from the consultations that we did with the IRPP really do emphasize the need to make sure that there are skilled and qualified people on his team. And I really have every confidence that he will do that. In the OIC, it does lay out important principles and a guiding mandate for him. And I have full confidence that he'll be able to deliver that. But I'm going to turn it over to Matt with regards to the specific.
Very briefly, please, because I have another question.
Okay, sure.
Well, maybe if I could just touch really quickly on the accountability. I've heard a couple times mention of accountability, mention of detailed budget plans. I just want to be clear that the Debates Commission, like any department, will have to come forward with a departmental plan, which gets tabled in Parliament. It has to go forth for its main estimates, which gets tabled in Parliament.
I do understand. That's all financial accountability. I'm just talking about putting on a program that Canadians will want to watch and be engaged in. And I don't think in all of the debates that I've witnessed back since black and white television and just banging the rocks together, in fact, that we've never come up with a format that really has seemed to work. In some cases, it's a big catfight between the various candidates. Others, you have journalists operating from their echo chambers, trying to suppose what's interesting to the public. Have we actually received any leadership or inclination from the public about what they would like to see covered and how they'd like it to see it covered?
So I think your question gets to the point of why we've put forward a debates commission in the first place, because over the past decades and particularly in recent history, it's been a political exercise, right, or a partisan exercise, or a strictly journalistic exercise, and the key point here that's I think important in his mandate is that they're to be done in the public interest. And I think that Mr. Johnson is actually uniquely positioned to be able to draw on experts both in broadcasting, academia, civil society, to really ensure that the product that will be delivered is one that speaks to Canadians. And so that's one of the things that we heard time and time again through our roundtables and conversations across the country, is to do exactly what you're talking about, is put together a product that will be interesting for Canadians, that Canadians will want to engage with, but also one that can be used freely, which I think is really actually the most important part of it, is that the feed is made available to whoever wants to use it, because then they can share it on diverse platforms or use different parts. If there's I'm just speculating here, but let's say there's a group that's interested in the environment and climate change. Well, if there's a question on the environment and climate change, that's something that they can focus on. So I think that this is, I'm a bit of a political geek myself, but I think this is really exciting. So.
Thank you. David, do you have a really short question to answer? Then we'll go
Real
to Ms.
fast.
Kuzi.
Thanks, Chair. I appreciate that. The chief electoral officer has, and there's a technical term, and I don't know it, but what it means is that his budget is basically unlimited. Once he gets into running an election, he can access funding that he needs. Would the debates commissioner have the same thing, given the fact that there's a sort of an artificial number? If he runs into a wall in terms of expenses, what happens?
So it is a set amount approved by Parliament. If the debates commissioner was to run into a wall and they've given no indication, there would be a process like any department where the debates commissioner would put in a funding request to the minister, and it would go from there. But again, there's been no indication that they don't feel they have enough money, and if they did, there are mechanisms for us to.
So that could happen quickly, like. It's just a paper thing.
Absolutely. And maybe just finishing what I started to say earlier, the reason I was mentioning departmental plan and main estimates is when they're tabled, this committee has the opportunity to call the debates commissioner. And unlike calling PCO, where we're limited what we can say, he could actually go into details about exactly how he plans to spend it. Does he have enough money? All those questions that I think you're asking.
Right. Very good. Thank you. And thank you, Chair, for your indulgence.
Thank you. Ms. Kuzi.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Biddle touched upon this about raking over the coals. I'm not sure if that's what we ended up doing, and I certainly don't feel that's what we ended up doing for the Canadian public at the end of it with Bill C-76, where I'm hearing from you and the government that you want to make a real commitment to protecting Canadians and our electoral processes from foreign interference and influence. But really all we got out of 76 was an interference process where there's a tap on the hand, if there is foreign funding. But again, we tried as Conservatives to legislate amendments that would make it impossible for this to happen with segregated bank accounts, with doing more than the tap on the hand. In addition, with the platforms, all we ended up with were some lame registries, and it concerns me very much. In addition to, frankly, when you go in the mainstream media, Minister, when you went on the West Block and said you expect social media platforms to do more to protect the 2019 federal election from foreign interference, and you asked them to take lessons learned from around the world and apply them in Canada. I mean, is this is very disturbing to me that you are asking corporations out of their own goodwill to try and protect Canadians and our electoral processes, again, rather than taking responsibility yourself, both as the minister and the government. So please, given the weak outcomes of C-76 and your comments in the media, can you please provide any more assurance to the committee and Canadians here today that the 2019 will have the most assurances possible to be kept safe from foreign influence?
So I actually think that C-76 was a good example of, taking suggestions from all of the different political parties represented around the table, particularly with regards to the ad registry and many of the items with regards to third parties. I mean, several of those suggestions and recommendations were taken that were put forward by the Conservatives and the NDP, and actually a number of them were put forward by all of the political parties. So I think that's really a testament to parliamentary democracy. I would encourage this committee to do a study of the role of social media in democracy, if that's something that you think is interesting, and to hold the social media companies to account. And I would welcome suggestions and feedback in terms of, how to appropriately regulate or legislate that behavior, because I think one of the biggest challenges, and you can see this around the world, is that the path forward is not as clear. And I think that this is something that Canadians would certainly appreciate. I mean, I think one of the, maybe it was Mr. Biddle who mentioned, or actually, no, there was a study that came out today that I think said 6 in 10 Canadians don't, feel good about Facebook and the upcoming election. And so I think that this is another example where we can work together, put partisanship aside, and come up with what the appropriate path forward is, because we want to ensure that, we're providing that important public space that social media provides for people to express themselves, but also mitigating some of the negative impacts that can also arise through social media. And so I think this would be something very interesting for this committee to work on if you choose to do that. I'm also happy to speak with any of you individually about ideas or thoughts that you have. And I think that the program that we put forward on January 30th with regards to protecting our democracy is quite comprehensive and tries to tackle the issue from many different sides to provide Canadians with the assurance that the government is taking this seriously. We're looking at it from both a hard and a soft angle, but ultimately, we have to work together as Canadians, because the ultimate target for our democracy is the Canadian voter, because the Canadian voter is the one that holds the power in terms of the votes that they cast. And so what we need to do, both myself, the government, but also as parliamentarians, is ensuring Canadians have the information they need to make informed choices.
And thank you, Minister. And as a former Foreign Service officer and security officer, I would just counsel you to get as much information as you can from your counterparts. And as a member of this committee, I would hope that you would share it with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kusi. Just go to the votes now. Shall vote 1B under Leaders Debates Commission in the supplementary estimates carry? Yes. On division. On division. Shall vote 1 under the Leaders Debates Commission in the interim estimates carry? Yes. On division. On division. Shall vote 1 report in the supplementary estimates B and the interim estimates. Oh, shall I report the votes in the supplementary estimates B and the interim estimates to the House? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Minister, and your colleagues for coming. Just before, there is another committee in here, but just before we break, I had 2 quick things. Maybe I'll read this. We're doing the 2-house study, and normally the clerk tweets out something. So basically it says the committee is studying whether it would be advantageous to the House of Commons to establish a parallel debating chamber. Parallel debating chambers can serve as additional forums for debate on certain kinds of parliamentary business and have been used by the parliaments of Australia and the United Kingdom since the 1990s. Any problem with that? And so Thursday is our lunch. Hopefully you can all make it. And next Tuesday, Bruce Stanton will be from 11 to 12. From 12 to 1, we had subcommittee on agenda procedures on this, but we can also, I think we talked about, we also do the report of the on the privilege motion. In that hour too, we'll discuss the final report, and the researcher will send that out next Tuesday.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay? Okay? Everyone's good? We're adjourned.
We only have 1 hour for this one.